Thank you. So welcome everyone. First session of the afternoon. So hopefully we will not lull into the post-lunch tiredness, because we've got a great session ahead and I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy it. So it certainly builds on what you've heard this morning, except now we're going to turn to consider the built environment. So with that in mind, we've got a great panel. So we've got our own Kelly Nugent, one of our senior procurement specialists within the construction, transport and environment team. We've got Jan Reid, who works for Scottish Enterprise, and she's head of marine and low carbon technology. But first, we're going to hear from Duncan Smith, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Association of Environmentally Conscious Building. So Duncan, I'm going to hand over to you, and then as a panel we'll have a chat, particularly about some of the content that I'm sure you're going to share with us. So over to you, Duncan. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hopefully you can all see the slide, and thanks you for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm Duncan Smith. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the ACB, and we're an organisation that works with government, public bodies and industry to promote more sustainable building practices.
But it's
through higher standards, both operational and embodied carbon. We're a UN Centre of Excellence for high performance buildings here in the UK, and my background's in primarily house building, energy and asset management as well, but over the last 10 years in retrofit. For most of the last 10 years I've been working in social housing retrofit. I'm a board member at the CIH, and I'm also a charter surveyor, so I've got a number of other hats that I use as well. But what I want to talk about first of all is to give you a feel for the built environment. We talk about the built environment quite a lot and why it's important. I want to give you an idea of Scotland's housing stock and what it looks like, give you a flavour for why or where the issues lie and what we have. And this is a slide showing 4 graphs and charts on residential properties. The data themselves comes from a mixture of BRE and Scottish Government, so they're pretty reliable. I'm trying to paint a picture here, in particular with the figures in pink about what we use and proportionally what we use in the properties we have. Proportionally, we've got some of the oldest homes in Europe, about 30% built before 1944. So getting on for about 70 years old. And fuel, you can see there in the top left, we use the majority of fuel to heat our homes, and for hot waters, gas, and that's even more so within the urban areas. A mixture of electricity and solid fuel for the remainder, but the primary fuel source is gas. Now, tenure, we've got more social housing here in Scotland than the rest of the UK, about 25% as opposed to 20% in UK as a whole. But what's quite interesting in the bottom left graph here, in terms of the type of properties we have, we've got a significant proportion of flatted properties, and given the issues, or given the historic issues with the right to buy in social housing, that's a big factor here, especially when we come to look at things like investment and the consultation we have to go through to improve and upgrade our homes to meet our climate change targets. So what we have there is older properties, fuelled mainly by carbon or fossil fuels, with a tenure that favours more social rented, and a type that is more complex to try and consult and engage with. So some quite unique challenges there. Just one point, that 36% in terms of flats here in Scotland, that's only 20% in the UK, so a much higher proportion overall than other parts of the UK. Now, why is this important, and how do these statistics in the previous slide, which was pretty dry, how do they translate in terms of the cost of our buildings? It's important to frame that, because those factors play a massive role in the carbon that our buildings emit. 20% of our carbon, our overall carbon in the UK, comes from just heating our homes. That's not our overall buildings consumption, but just heating our domestic properties. So a huge amount of carbon coming from simply heating our homes. 80% of the homes that we'll have in 2050, when Westminster's climate agenda or net zero targets are due, 80% of the homes have already been built. So the problem exists here just now. It's not something we can build our way out of, and it's not something we can get around. 80% of those properties in 2050 are already here. And what do they cost us? Well, You've probably seen some various reports in the news over the last few months or so. I think the Chief Executive of Scottish Power was on talking about the potential for £3,000 energy bills come the autumn of this year. And that's about 50 billion we're on target to spend as a nation over the next decade. A phenomenal amount of money. And how does that affect us in terms of the affordability? Well, those price rises are looking at, potentially come autumn, looking at putting as many as 1 million households into fuel poverty, about 40% of the overall households we have in Scotland. And what's important to talk about when we're talking about net zero is the challenge, the challenge of what we're going to have to do to transform our building stock, to transform our homes, and the issues that we'll face. I really think over the next 10 years or so, we'll face a radical transformation in how we heat and power our homes. And hopefully what we can do with this presentation is give you a flavour for some of those policies. And it's very important that in achieving our net zero targets that we think about sustainability, not just from an environmental perspective, but also a social perspective. We have to make sure that when we address our properties, that we do it in a responsible way. We have to be in line with the just transition that the Scottish Government has set. And by creating potentially environmentally sustainable homes, we don't create unaffordable and unsustainable housing. This is a slide here from properties in Eastern Europe where they were cold, damp, and became unusable, essentially. So we have to bear in mind that climate change and the environmental impact of it also has a social element that we have to be mindful of. And in terms of what our government's doing about climate change, the built environment, housing, I've got some points here. It's a local authority audience, so you will know probably as much as me, but they're a fairly progressive bunch of Scottish Government. A little bit of criticism in the last few weeks or so, last few months or so from the Climate Change Committee, but overall, these are some of the key policies that the Scottish Government have put in place to address climate change as well as fuel poverty. And I think looking at the ambitions that the Scottish Government have, both in the heat and building strategy, as well as LHEs and the heat networks bill, I think there's some pretty ambitious targets in terms of where they're trying to take the built environment. Can talk more about these points, the legislation in the Q&A, in particular LHEs and the impact or the work that local authorities will need to do around that. And what does that transition look like? The transformation, I guess, is pretty hefty. It's 2 million homes to move to, say, electric heating here. Really, I should have used the term low carbon heating, and that's a mixture of heat pumps and low carbon district heating, low carbon heat networks, as we call it. And that's a phenomenal cost. This cost of 36 billion is one that Patrick Harvey uses quite a bit. And it's to all buildings, as opposed to just private or domestic property. So a lot of money required in that transition, and a lot of money required in the electricity generation and capacity network as well, which is often overlooked. But the impacts this will have are, this is CITB figures here, about 22,500 jobs required year on year to 2028 around low carbon. That's not just housing or buildings, that's all low carbon jobs. So a significant impact that can have on the economy. Sorry. And what I want to just briefly talk about is the metrics. So when we look at what we have to do, the decarbonisation of homes, and we talk about heat pumps and insulation, what I want to just bring it back to is the metric, what it is we use. We use things like EPCs, or we use things like SAP or PHPP. But fundamentally, what we've got to get our head round about is the requirement to reduce the demand on heating, on domestic heating through insulation, through fabric improvements, because that is where the success within both fuel poverty and climate change lie. It's to reduce that little equation, that kilowatt hours per square metre per annum, which has a direct impact on how much you spend for gas, electricity. That's where we've really got to focus our attention on. And that's where things like thermal comfort and an internal environment which is compatible or which is conducive to health exists. We've got to look at how we reduce the demand for heating in that context. And what I want to just show, going back to the previous slide about the Scottish Government's policies in terms of low carbon heating and in terms of heat pumps, this is something that we've made ourselves. So it's not particularly scientifically accurate, but what it does show you is the transformation from gas, which is in purple there in the left-hand side, over every year to green, which is in some form of low carbon heating gas. I've said electricity again here, but it really should be low carbon heating. And what this is trying to show you is the scale of the challenge. It's a massive undertaking to switch gas to low carbon heating, and over the next decade we'll really start to see some significant changes in how that's delivered. 1 million heat pumps in the heat and building strategy that the Scottish Government has until 2030, and over 500,000 social rented homes probably changed, maybe as part of EIS over the next decade as well, to some form of low carbon heating. There's currently about 12,000 gas engineers working in the UK, and again we have to think about this from a skills perspective, because those engineers will have to train and become competent in other forms of technology. Don't want to talk about this too much. It's maybe something Kelly can touch on in part of the Q&A, but what I'm trying to show here is that a holistic approach is also a collective approach, and I think that's where Scotland Excel have developed particularly robust frameworks that allow authorities and landlords to deliver really high-end retrofit. This wasn't delivered using Scotland Excel framework, I should add, but all of the component parts here are available within the new energy efficiency framework. So this is a project I was involved in about a year ago, where we took a 1930s solid wall property and we upgraded it to what you can see down below. So the transition that we need to go through in order to use renewables is such that what Scotland Excel have in that framework would allow you to do most, if not all, of the work here. And what I like to try and do with this slide is to try and reframe the argument, or to try and talk about not just the challenge but also the opportunity. And far too often we get caught up in the enormity of the challenge, but what we need to look at is two things. Is first of all how housing and buildings are connected, they're interconnected to the environment, to our communities, to the economy, for our health. So there's a huge impact that high quality, good quality housing can have. Internal environments that are healthy and conducive to a healthy life can have on both our society, on our health, but also how the materials and contracts in place to provide those services can have an impact on an economy, or our economy, and have a more sophisticated economy as a result of the ask to the market for what we're trying to deliver, and how that has a huge impact on communities. My type is often too technical. We talk about buildings without the occupants in mind, but the community, or all houses are part of the community, all homes are part of the community. So there's a huge impact that we can have, huge positive impact that we can have here through retrofit, through climate change, through addressing fuel poverty. And the last slide, just before we go into the next presentation, is really just to try and, again, reframe the argument. It's not about individual work here, although that is important to the collective aim. It's about how we can come together as organisations on the same pathway with the same objectives and the same pressures towards a common goal, towards a common shared goal. So hopefully this is the message that comes across from today. And that's me. The last thing I would say is we're part of we being the ACB lead the United Nations Economic Council for Europe High Performance Buildings programme here in the UK, and we'd be delighted to talk to any organisation who might be interested in membership or learning through that experience. And that's me. Thank you.
Duncan, that was fantastic. Thanks very much. Lots of food for thought there. One of the slides that I thought was particularly interesting, which is certainly prompting my first question, which was the slide that you showed about the source of the loss of heat and energy from houses. 35% walls, 25% on roofs. So coming up in 2/3 from walls and roofs. So So the obvious first question should be, should all buildings be deep retrofitted? Should we have an active plan to do that?
It's an interesting point. I think what you've got to look at, and I imagine the audience here is similar. I should add that I used to work at Renfrewshire Council as the asset manager there, and I think what we have to look at is how housing is segmented into different tenure types. So I think when you're looking at the social housing market, there is a significant pressure there from affordability, or from a cost of living perspective. So I think we have to go deeper, certainly, for some tenures than perhaps others. I do think what we should probably have in place is a journey or a plan for the improvement of properties over a decade period, a multiple decade period, where we do move to deeper retrofits, if not indeed a deep retrofit. Because the issue about not tackling head-on the demand side isn't going to go away. And even with low-carbon heating systems, which are greener, they can be more expensive in that they are powered by electricity. So we have to ensure that the heat that we need is of a residual amount, so that we're trying to reduce that in as much as we can. What I would probably say is rather than, I would probably use the term holistic. We probably have to use the term holistic so that we address walls, windows, doors, openings in a way that doesn't lock in bad decisions, that doesn't lock in a poor retrofit just now that can't be upgraded in the future. So I would always, I would always favour a deep retrofit, especially in social housing, but I would certainly favour an approach that works towards a deep retrofit, if that answers the question.
Sure, thanks. And I guess, linked to that, you mentioned the fact that the Scottish Government has recently implemented the heat and building strategy. So I guess I'd like to hear your views on this, Duncan, and then maybe Kelly, given your experience, Kelly. But should we be, across the country, all of us, prioritising upgrading the heat source over building fabric?
Do you want to go, Kelly, or this is something Kelly and I talk about quite often?
Yeah, we could probably tag team this, to be honest, Duncan. So obviously Duncan's got much more experience in this area because he's had to physically consider it for the housing stock across Renfrewshire, and probably the work that he does just now. I think we need to do both. I think ultimately every time we talk about this, we talk about you need to do both. And it's not even about the doing both, it's about getting the right heat source and the right measures for the building. Because if you get that fundamentally wrong, you're not hitting the requirements under the policy obligations, and you're actually putting tenants into an area of detrimental impact. And I think when we talk about this, we get caught up in what the policy is and what the delivery is. And like Duncan had said in his slides, we forget about the tenants sometimes. And ultimately, we're all in these roles and jobs to deliver, to ensure that the tenant is in a warm, healthy and happy home. So the technicalities that sit around the fabric side and heat side, Duncan can then go on to sort of explain why we need both. But my views are absolutely it's both. It's not one or the other. It should be both.
Duncan?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we run the risk of, if we prioritise the heat side without addressing fundamentally the demand side, especially if that heat is powered by electricity. I mean, today we've got, I think, 28 pence a kilowatt hour electricity, as opposed to 7-8 pence gas. So we by not addressing that, we don't give renewables the best chance. And I think that's where sometimes people think there's two camps. There's renewables, or there's guys like me who are more susceptible to retrofit and deep retrofit. But the reality is that they both can go together well. What I would say is, and I think this is allowed within the energy efficiency framework that you have, is I would say it's good design. It's good design from a fabric perspective, and it's good design from a heating perspective, because you can chuck in a heat pump and not design it particularly well, and well, you really need to hope for the best there. I think it's about how we make sure that we, and I say this is from still with a social housing hat on, that we as the commissioners of work, of the owners of work, have to get involved in what that work looks like. Now, I'm not talking about technical specifications, but what I am talking about is an understanding of what the works will achieve. So you have to own the design, or own an understanding of the design and what you're trying to deliver. And that has to be about reducing kilowatt hours per square metre, and it has to be about designing heat pumps to the maximum efficiency.
But see, given those, potentially conflicting priorities, it would be naive not to think about that in the context of new innovation, new developments. And then we're faced with the age-old problem of, is now the right time to start retrofitting, upgrading, or do we wait and see what's round the corner? So, it's the wait or the go. And I guess, that couples with the whole notion around alternative solutions. Now, you touched on hydrogen in your presentation, and you indicated that your view was that potential was the appropriate solution from a domestic setting. However, using that as an example, but not necessarily exclusively so, it's the old adage of the conflict between wait and see, because there might be something better around the corner, because we don't want to do something that's going to last a generation if something else could have bettered it. So what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So the hydrogen debates are interesting one, and I think hydrogen has a massive place in the net zero economy, just not in housing. I think we will need lots of hydrogen for some of the heavy lifting, the chemical industry, agriculture, things like that. But I think in terms of the efficiency of hydrogen from a domestic perspective, it's not very efficient. So to create lots of electricity to make green hydrogen, it seems daft to use that electricity to hydrogen production and then transport it through the gas pipeline. I think it's actually quite. I think we should not wait, because by waiting the situation becomes worse. I don't think there's a silver bullet. In fact, I think we have all of the tools we need. Heat pumps have been about for 30, 40 years. There's 5 million in continental Europe. If you go to Sweden, most properties are powered, certainly outside the main towns, by hydrogen. If you go to Denmark, places like Copenhagen, 97% of people use low carbon heat networks. So I think the technologies are here. I think the processes are here. We just have to start to get on and do them in a way that is sustainable.
So I think that's a good point, and I agree, which begs the obvious question for you, Jan. The work that you do with Scottish Enterprise. So do you think the supply chain is geared up for the demand?
Well, we know that we've got to develop the supply chain, and we've had some activities around about that. We obviously just recently as well launched Heat Source that's been delivered for us from Best, and we have got a Scottish-wide directory. There are over 350 companies currently just now in Scotland that are working in the low carbon heat area. I'm confident they can grow. We're very strong in Scotland in terms of engineering services, and Scottish Enterprise is working with those companies to make sure that they build capacity and capability. If anything, what companies complain to me about is a lack of projects for them to work on just now. That's because obviously if a company wants to invest, then you have to see a project pipeline in order for them to make that investment to grow their capability.
So if you think about that in a bit kind of wider context, then about how you match those up, what are Scottish Enterprise currently working on to try to kind of correlate that supply and demand line, Jan?
Well, I mean, I did take there's some interesting questions in chat, but I can add to the chat the sort of directory that we've produced, as well as oops, that's the wrong thing. Take that off. If I can, I'll not be able to work it out to take that off. Sorry about that. As well as doing a directory and as well as doing a heat source, we are also working on specific projects with the Scottish Government to develop the capacity to, as I said, Hugh, basically to develop companies and to stretch them over and to bring other companies in. I should say that we're having a lot of interest from outside Scotland, and we're very fortunate in the sense that we do have companies such as Mitsubishi who produce air source heat pumps for the whole of Europe and not just within Scotland and the UK. We also have great companies. I saw a question in about what other things we're doing. We have companies such as Sunamp that actually can provide heat thermal storage, and combined with a heat pump can actually duplicate what a Combi Boiler does by providing hot water on demand. And these are all companies that are present, and actually if they were here on the basis of the Scottish domestic market, they would have gone a long time ago. They're actually using Scotland as a base. So I'm confident that based on our engineering skills and our current capability of companies, that we have got the companies that can deliver. I would also like to say, in terms of heat networks, we often sort of do ourselves down and we talk about what's happening in the rest of Europe. But what you tend to find is the rest of Europe, they may have pipes in the ground, but quite often they're connected to boilers. So they're also having to go through a transition as well and moving to low carbon heat source. And in terms of 5th generation district heating, we're actually one of the leaders in Europe in terms of adopting that.
Thanks, Jan. Just before I conclude with a final question about skills and capability, some of the questions that are in the chat, maybe if I could pick up one or two of those. So an interesting one from Robert Kelly, and it's about, we talked about retrofit, and Robert mentioned specifically about new build affordable homes, and then, the whole kind of whole life costing against, what it costs to build new, what it costs to retrofit versus, the cost over the life of the property. So I guess that's an interesting debate that we're likely to see, and it touches a bit on the other part of the discussion, Duncan, about retrofit or whatever. But then where is that and the continuum between that and a new build, and ensuring that you can factor some of those areas in?
I think I saw it as an interesting question. I think there's a really good report. So Nidri Road was a passive house project that Glasgow University and John Gilbert Architects delivered, and I can put a link in the chat to the report, because Ken Gibb, who is over, I think he's still over at Glasgow, I think his conclusions were that even though the costs were high for retrofit, that the overall long-term benefits were supportive of retrofit to a deep standard, because the cost of demolition, repurposing, land acquisition and then new build is very, very high when you look at that. So he's got some quite accurate figures that back that up. Now, it probably won't surprise anyone from an operational carbon perspective. If you're building new build, I think it should be passive. In a social housing setting, I think you've really got to make a strong argument why it's not, or if you are not building to passive house standard, it's passive equivalent or passive house principles. So that for me, I think, and I'll give you a good example. This is a real example. I'm in a 2016 new build. It's A-rated and it cost me £3,000 to heat. So what we have in new build is a performance gap that's kind of not really understood. And I think what we have to look at is how we properly measure, again, the kilowatt hours that we're placing in terms of the demand on social tenants. And even though the house might be a lot better from its livability aspect, I think we have to be looking at passive house, certainly in social housing.
Thanks, Duncan. So final question, but we will, any of the questions that come into the chat, we'll certainly follow up on them if we haven't had the chance to bring them out. So the final question for me, probably towards you, Kelly, which is, based on the work that we've been doing and based on the dialogue that you've had with colleagues across the sector, have we got the skills and capability within the sector to meet the demand?
Thanks, Hugh, and that's a very good question, actually. So I guess the long and the short of it is it's a huge challenge for the construction sector. Currently, we don't have the skills within the sector, but it's a massive opportunity for us to create more productive and sustainable industry. The CITV published a report recently, and I think that's where Duncan's probably taken some of his figures from. And it's for us to stay on track to achieve net zero throughout the UK, the construction industry will need 300,000 new roles to be created by 2028. Now, I know the Scottish Government's currently doing a piece of work to look more specifically about what those requirements are within Scotland, but it's a massive opportunity to create clear career pathways for their future generations. Everybody knows that the skills challenge around net zero is huge, but there's a lot of work getting done to actually look at that. And a big part of that will be to upskill our current workforce, which the skills matrix, which was actually developed with ESP and partners across the sector, will help, because that's looking at the current industry for delivering energy efficiency measures and what the requirements are there. But there'll also be a huge opportunity in this space for a mixture of new job creation, and then obviously with industry innovation happening, particularly around decarbonisation of buildings, it's a massive opportunity for Scotland to actually drive towards achieving the role requirements. The biggest thing for us is working in collaboration. We can't possibly do it in silos, and there's a few key factors that we need to have in place to enable us to do that. So we need to be really clear on what the skills are that are required across the sector. So as I said, Scottish Government's doing a piece of work mapping that out just now, with a report that will probably follow pretty soon. But I think from our membership's awareness, we probably need to understand what is our internal requirements within our organisation. If you're currently getting staff that deliver some of this work for you already, and how do you tap into the funding opportunities that the Scottish Government's creating with partners such as ESP to actually allow your staff to get upskilled within the sector, as well as the rest of the construction industry and the contractor base there. Another piece of work, and it's a bit that Scotland Excel's actually been doing with the colleges across Scotland, just utilising the EC framework, is we need to look at mapping out where the skills requirements are, because the colleges can't do that without the data to inform them. So we need to do a bit of an exercise to say this is where the skills gaps are, this is the locations across Scotland where they are. Because bearing in mind, you're trying to upskill a workforce that you're also expecting to deliver for you at this point as well. So we need to work together to say this is where the skills requirements are, this is the courses we need within each of the colleges, and we need to also look and pull on the funding opportunities that are available. And the only way to actually do that is to be open and really act fast to the change and the opportunities that come out over the next few years within this space.
Thanks, Kelly. And I think you mentioned the key word, which is collaboration. Collaboration across, not our sector, but cross-sectorally. But that includes through academia, through technical development, as well as commercial development. So I agree. So thank you. So thank you very much for all of our panel members, to Duncan, to Jan, to Kelly. As I mentioned earlier, the questions that were in the chat that we didn't get to, we'll ensure that they're followed up upon. So I'd like to bring this section to a close. Thanks again for your participation. And just a reminder that the next session that we have is at 2:45, and it's about supply chain disruption, development and resilience. And that's led by our own Mary Mitchell, and look forward to seeing you there. So again, thanks very much, everyone. Appreciate it. Bye for now.